Assalamu alaikum, my dear students. I welcome you all to this another lecture. And in this lecture, we are going to continue talking about the white blood cells or leukocytes. In our previous lecture, we have talked about the morphology of the different types of white blood cells, and this lecture is particularly going to be about the functions of these different types of white blood cells. Now, the function of white blood cells in general is they help us in fighting against the infections and diseases. But their mechanism of action is actually that varies from that varies in these different types of white blood cells. But the general function of these white blood cells is that they help us in fighting against infections and diseases. Now, let us talk about the functions of these different types of white blood cells, or we can say the mechanism of these different types of white blood cells, and we will mainly focus on the secretions of these different types of white blood cells, which actually are very important for their particular function. Right. Now, let us suppose, I have told you that white blood cells, they help us in fighting against infections and diseases. Now, suppose there is a pathogen in our body. And that pathogen, suppose here in this green color I mentioned here, this pathogen is any bacteria. And this bacteria is actually going to create some disturbances in our body, and this bacteria is actually going to damage the tissue this bacteria has invaded. Now suppose here is a tissue, here is a group of cells, and this tissue has been invaded by this bacteria. You can see this green star. This is the bacteria with these black dots. These black dots represent actually the antigens which are with this bacteria. अब ये बैक्टीरिया जो है, ये जब इस टिश्यू साइट में पहुंच जाएगा, this bacteria will actually start secreting endotoxins. And endotoxins are the chemicals which are actually going to create the disturbances here, and these endotoxins are going to start damaging this tissue. Right? These endotoxins are going to start damaging this tissue. Now suppose it has damaged, these endotoxins has started damaging this tissue, and now this tissue looks something like this. Right. As soon as this tissue actually is being damaged by these endotoxins, these टिश्यू सेल्स जो ये सेल्स यहाँ पे प्रेजेंट होती है, the affected cells, they start producing certain chemicals. They start producing certain chemicals, and these chemicals, they start producing certain chemicals. For example, these chemicals are, for example, prostaglandins. These chemicals are bradykinins. These chemicals are leukotrienes. Actually, these chemicals are very important for activating our white blood cells to show their response against this pathogen which has invaded our tissue and which has started damaging our body tissue. Right? These chemicals are very important. And these endotoxins not only damage these tissues, these endotoxins actually start stimulating, or it start activating a particular type of cell which is present there in the tissue, which is actually the permanent resident of the tissue, which actually is present along these blood vessels, or which are present there in the skin, which are present there in the mucous membranes, and that particular type of cell is called as mast cell. That particular cell is called as mast cell. Now, that mast cell actually it has these receptors present on the cell membrane, on its membrane, and these receptors are actually activated by these endotoxins which are secreted by this bacteria. Right? And this mast cell, it actually resembles these are just like basophils. Basophils का जो काम है, the same thing is done by the mast cells. The difference is that basophils are present there in the blood circulation, and mast cells are present in the tissue sites. They are actually the permanent residents of the tissue. Right? अब यहाँ पे जो ये mast cells है, and one more thing, the basophil has the bilobed nucleus, and they have a large nucleus, these mast cells, and mast cells are also formed there in the bone marrow. You have to remember this. Now, these mast cells they also start secreting these chemicals. these mast cells also start secreting these chemicals, the chemicals which has been secreted by this damaged endothelium. Right? अब ये जो chemicals है, they act as they are actually chemoattractants. What they do is these chemicals act on these endothelial cells. The endothelial cells, here is the blood vessel, and in this blood vessel we have the different types of blood cells which are actually there present there in the blood, and one of the type of blood cell is actually the neutrophil, which I have shown here. Right? Neutrophil, the type of white blood cell. There can be red blood cells present, there can be platelets present, there can be other types of white blood cells present, but I have mentioned just here the neutrophils. Right? अब यहाँ पे जो ये blood vessel है, इस blood vessel के wall में we have these cells and these cells are called as endothelial cells. Right? अब जब ये chemicals जो है, when they will be secreted by this damaged tissue, or they will be secreted by these mast cells, these chemicals will go and stimulate, or they will go and act on these endothelial cells. Now there will be certain changes in these endothelial cells. Now what will be the changes? The first thing is the endothelial cells, as soon as they are activated, or as soon as they are stimulated by all these chemicals, they start expressing this protein on their membrane. And this protein, which is expressed by these endothelial cells, is actually called as selectin. This protein is called as selectin. This protein is called as selectin, and this selectin protein is expressed by this endothelial cell, and when this endothelial cell is stimulated by these chemoattractants, or when these endothelial cells are stimulated by all these chemicals, cytokines, which are secreted by the damaged tissue or which are secreted by the mast cells. That is the first thing, that selectin is expressed. The second thing is that these endothelial cells start contracting, and they start contracting in such a way that the gap between these endothelial cells start increasing. Here you can see we can say that there is no gap between this endothelial and this endothelial cell. There is no gap present between this endothelial cell and this endothelial cell. But once they are stimulated by all these chemicals, ये endothelial cells they start contracting, and they start contracting in such a way that there will be actually gaps. These gaps between the endothelial cells will start increasing, and there will be actually gaps formed in between these endothelial cells, just like this. Now what will happen is कि जब इस blood से अब ये neutrophils, most importantly neutrophils and macrophages also, because इस tissue site में which has been infected by a pathogen, इसमें सबसे पहले जो cell पहुंच जाती है among all the white blood cells is neutrophil, and which is actually followed by the monocyte. Right? Because these are actually the cells which are responsible for giving us that first line of defense. So first there will be neutrophil which is coming out, which will be followed by the monocyte, and that monocyte, when it reaches to the tissues, it becomes the macrophage. Right? अब यहाँ से जो है ये neutrophil जब ये blood से circulate कर रही है, this neutrophil on its membrane, it also has a membrane protein, and that membrane protein is called as integrin. Let me write it here. This membrane protein is called as integrin. So integrin protein is actually a membrane protein which is present in different types of cells. In this case, it is present with the neutrophils, and this integrin protein is actually helpful for the adhesion of this cell. It is helpful for the adhesion of this cell. And adhesion क्यों करना है हमें? क्योंकि जो ये न्यूट्रोफिल हमें इस ब्लड से फ्लो कर रहा है, जो ये न्यूट्रोफिल इस ब्लड से जा रहा है, इस ब्लड वेसल से जा रहा है इन द ब्लड, इस न्यूट्रोफिल को हमें पहुंचाना है इन द टिश्यू साइट, सो दैट इट कैन फाइट अगेंस्ट द बैक्टीरिया. अब इस न्यूट्रोफिल को वहां तक पहुंचाने के लिए द फर्स्ट थिंग वी हैव टू डू इज वी हैव टू स्लो डाउन द स्पीड ऑफ दिस न्यूट्रोफिल which is actually flowing in the blood, which is present there in the blood stream. हमें इस न्यूट्रोफिल का स्पीड जो है उसको कम करना है. अब उस स्पीड को कम करने के लिए जैसे ही ये न्यूट्रोफिल यहां से आ जाएगा, दिस न्यूट्रोफिल हैज अ प्रोटीन कॉल्ड एज इंटेग्रिन. दीज एंडोथेलियल सेल्स आर जो है हैज द प्रोटीन, इट एक्सप्रेसेस अ प्रोटीन व्हिच इज कॉल्ड एज सेलेक्टिन. अब जैसे ही यहां पे पहुंच जाएगा, दिस इंटेग्रिन एंड सेलेक्टिन जो है ये आपस में मिलके दे विल एक्चुअली स्लो डाउन द स्पीड ऑफ दीज न्यूट्रोफिल्स, द न्यूट्रोफिल्स व्हिच आर प्रेजेंट देयर इन द ब्लड स्ट्रीम. अब जब हम इन न्यूट्रोफिल्स को जो है स्लो डाउन करेंगे, दैट मीन्स दिस न्यूट्रोफिल विल गेट एडहियर टू द सरफेस ऑफ द एंडोथेलियल सेल. राइट, ये इस एंडोथेलियल सरफेस के साथ, आप ऐसा समझ ले, ये इस एंडोथेलियल सरफेस के साथ चिपक जाएगा. और जब ये इसके साथ चिपक जाएगा, देन वी हैव दीज gaps we have created in between these endothelial cells, and now there will be certain changes. There will be certain changes in the cell membrane of these neutrophils, and these changes will be made with the help of that cytoskeleton. We call that as actin. That is actually microfilaments. Microfilaments in the neutrophils are very important for that process, for making certain changes. अब वो changes क्यों करनी है? क्योंकि इन न्यूट्रोफिल्स को अब इन छोटी छोटी गैप्स के थ्रू इस टिश्यू साइट में आना है फ्रॉम द सर्कुलेशन. राइट, अब जैसे ही ये न्यूट्रोफिल फॉर एग्जांपल यहां पे पहुंच जाएगा, दिस न्यूट्रोफिल हैज रीच्ड हियर, एंड दिस न्यूट्रोफिल हैज दिस integrin protein, and it has this endothelial cell has the selectin protein. Both these will be like this, and we will slow down the speed of the neutrophils, and after that this neutrophil will actually come out through these gaps which are present in between these endothelial cells, and these neutrophils will make certain changes, for example something like this, and we have these multilobed nucleus inside. Right, now neutrophils will come out. They will actually squeeze through these smaller gaps which are present in between these endothelial cells. And how we have created those gaps? We have created those gaps because these endothelial cells were stimulated by these chemicals, the chemicals which were released from that infected tissue. Right, अब ये जो process है, जिस प्रोसेस से ये WBCs, most importantly the neutrophils, which will be followed by the macrophages, which will be followed by the monocytes, and these neutrophils and monocytes are coming out into the tissue site through these smaller gaps in between the endothelial cells. This process is called as diapedesis. Right. Now diapedesis जो है, इसको हम diapedesis actually squeezing of these blood cells through these smaller gaps in between the endothelial cells. Okay, अब वो छोटी छोटी gaps को हमने कैसे form किया? I've already told you that. अब जैसे ही ये neutrophil or monocyte will come out of this blood vessel, now these chemicals which will be secreted by these damaged endothelium, or which will be secreted by the mast cells, these chemicals will actually start activating these neutrophils. Okay, or activating, we can say they are actually trying to attract the neutrophils towards the damaged tissue. Okay, damaged site. अब जब ये neutrophil जो है, जब ये बाहर आ गया ना, इसको ढूंढना है कि किस तरफ है बैक्टीरिया. अब बैक्टीरिया जिस तरफ होगा उसी तरफ जो है मास्ट सेल्स भी एक्टिवेट होंगी, उसी तरफ जो है टिश्यू भी डैमेज होगा, और उसी तरफ से वो केमिकल्स जो है रिलीज हो जाएंगे. वो केमिकल्स अब इस न्यूट्रोफिल को अट्रैक्ट करने की कोशिश करते हैं जिस तरफ जो है ये बैक्टीरिया इस टिश्यू को डैमेज कर रहा है. राइट, अब ये न्यूट्रोफिल है, नाउ इट विल बी अट्रैक्टेड टुवर्ड्स दिस डैमेज्ड टिश्यू, और इट विल बी अट्रैक्टेड टुवर्ड्स दिस पैथोजन. नाउ दिस प्रोसेस इज कॉल्ड एज कीमोटैक्सिस. Okay, this process is called as chemotaxis. अब chemotaxis जब इस white blood cell को ये particular chemicals जो है, ये इस white blood cells को attract करेंगे towards the damaged tissue, and उस process को हम कहते हैं chemotaxis. Right? अब diapedesis is the process through which the white blood cells are coming out of the blood vessel. Okay, this is the property of white blood cells, this diapedesis. This diapedesis is not the property with the red blood cells or platelets. This is the property with the white blood cells, particularly the neutrophils and the monocytes. And then chemotaxis is the process where these white blood cells are actually attracted towards the damaged tissue or they are attracted towards the pathogen. राइट अब इसके बाद जो है ये न्यूट्रोफिल और मोनोसाइट विल बी जो है कमिंग आफ्टर द न्यूट्रोफिल आफ्टर दैट दिस न्यूट्रोफिल एंड मोनोसाइट जो है ये इस बैक्टीरिया को जो है फैगोसाइटोस करेंगे because they are phagocytic cells, this neutrophil and the monocytes, they are the phagocytic cells and phagocytic cells जो है ये इस बैक्टीरिया को engulf करेंगे और उसके बाद जो है इस बैक्टीरिया को जो है डिग्रेड करने की कोशिश करेंगे. This is in case of bacteria. Now this is what happens when any pathogen is actually invading. Most importantly, I have given you the example of the bacteria is invading our tissue. Right? Now let us talk about the different types of these white blood cells. What are the secretions of these white blood cells and in what situations जो है ये white blood cells का अलग-अलग white blood cells का अपना रोल रहता है. Okay? Let us start with the neutrophils. Neutrophils का मैंने आपको बता दिया. Neutrophils are very important because I have told you in the last class that they are the most abundant type of cells, type of white blood cells present in the blood, and they account for about 50 to 70% of the total white blood cells. So जो total white blood cells है उनका 50 to 70% जो है they are neutrophils, and these neutrophils actually they help us in providing the first line of defense. First line of defense. That means irrespective of what type of pathogen is actually present there in the tissue, जो सबसे पहले इस टिश्यू साइट में व्हाइट ब्लड सेल पहुंच जाएगा दैट विल बी डेफिनेटली द न्यूट्रोफिल्स. एंड उसके बाद जो है न्यूट्रोफिल्स जो है फर्स्ट लाइन ऑफ डिफेंस जो है न्यूट्रोफिल्स के साथ साथ मोनोसाइट्स भी प्रोवाइड करते हैं और वो मोनोसाइट्स भी जो है न्यूट्रोफिल्स को फॉलो करते हैं बाहर जाने के लिए और मोनोसाइट भी बाहर आ जाते हैं irrespective of what type of pathogen is present there in the tissue. Right? So that is the first line of defense. I told you in the last class that we have white blood cells divided into two types. One is the granulocytes and the second type is agranulocyte. Granulocyte जो है इन granulocytes के cytoplasm में we have these granules and these granules जो है इन granules के अंदर वो सारे material जो है present होता है जो इन granulocytes को अपना action करने के लिए is very important. So these granules, मैंने आपको कहा है that these granules are the vesicular structures which contain those different substances. For example, the enzymes inside, with the enzymes which are actually very important for killing the microorganisms. Right? अब यहाँ पे जो है सबसे पहले we were talking about the neutrophils and neutrophils is actually a type of granulocyte and definitely there are granules which are present there in the neutrophils and those granules morphology में हमने बताया है that they are actually these granules जो है they attain the basic as well as the acidic dye. They appear जो है they appear the red as well as blue or they appear pink. That is the mixture of red and blue. राइट अब यहां पे जो है ये granules जो इस neutrophils के होते हैं these granules actually secrete different substances. Okay, once that bacteria has been taken into the neutrophil by the process of phagocytosis जो मैंने आपको वहां पे बता दिया जब वहां पे neutrophils पहुंच जाएंगे तो वो वहां पे जो है इस बैक्टीरिया को engulf करके अपने अंदर ले लेंगे. That process is called as phagocytosis. अब जब ये phagocytosis जो है हो जाएगा that means these neutrophils are activated. These neutrophils are activated and now these activated neutrophils will start secreting all that material which is present there in the granules of these neutrophils. Now what are those materials which are secreted by which are present there in the granules of the neutrophils are right here. The first thing is proteases. Proteases definitely the enzymes, myeloperoxidases and elastases. Now ये जो proteins है ये जो तीन चीजें हैं जो इन granules of the neutrophils में present होते हैं they are actually the enzymes and these enzymes are very important for the destruction of microorganisms. इसके बाद we have a very important substance which is present there in the neutrophils, or which is secreted by the neutrophils, is defensins and cathelicidins. Okay, and these defensins and cathelicidins, they are actually the peptides, and the peptides which are very, very important against the bacteria and fungi. They actually have the antibacterial activity, they actually have the antibacterial property or antimicrobial property, we can say, particularly the bacteria and the fungi. And then these defensins and cathelicidins जो है, इनका जो actually काम होता है, they also have the anti-inflammatory action, and then they are very, very important for the process of chemotaxis. जब न्यूट्रोफिल्स यहाँ पे जो है इसको, इस बैक्टीरिया को एंगल्फ करेंगे, दैट मींस न्यूट्रोफिल्स अब एक्टिवेट है, तो ये न्यूट्रोफिल्स या मोनोसाइट्स जो है ये और न्यूट्रोफिल्स को अब अट्रैक्ट करने की कोशिश करेंगे. Okay, because they will need more neutrophils there, they will need more monocytes there. तो अब यहां से जो है एक चीज that is जो है defensins and cathelicidins, तो ये chemotaxis में भी हेल्प करते हैं. That means ये और ज्यादा neutrophils को जो है अपनी इस damaged tissue या इस infected area की तरफ जो है attract करने की कोशिश करते हैं. इसके बाद ये जो defensins and cathelicidins है, they also have a small role in the wound healing as well, right? So wound healing. इसके बाद NADPH oxidase जो है, it is another enzyme जो ये न्यूट्रोफिल्स जो है सिक्रीट करते हैं, एंड इट ऑल्सो हैज द बैक्टीरिसाइडल एक्शन. ये भी एंटीबैक्टीरियल एजेंट जो है होता है. और उसके बाद प्लेटलेट एक्टिवेटिंग फैक्टर जो है और एक चीज है जो ये न्यूट्रोफिल्स सिक्रीट करते हैं, एंड दिस प्लेटलेट एक्टिवेटिंग फैक्टर इज वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट फॉर द प्रोसेस ऑफ एग्रीगेशन ऑफ प्लेटलेट्स. फॉर एग्जांपल, इफ देयर इज डैमेज टू द ब्लड वेसल, सो देयर विल बी जो है लॉस ऑफ ब्लड. सो इन ऑर्डर टू प्रिवेंट दैट लॉस ऑफ ब्लड, वी हैव टू बी इन्वॉल्व इन अ प्रोसेस कॉल्ड एज hemostasis. Hemostasis is actually when we stop that bleeding. Okay, and then we have to be involved in the process of clotting, that formation of a clot. तो उसके लिए the addition of platelets, the aggregation of platelets, that is very important. There is going to be a separate lecture about the hemostasis and coagulation, जहां पे हम बात करेंगे about the importance of this platelet activating factor, which actually promotes the aggregation of platelets. Okay, that is about the neutrophils. अब इसके बाद जो eosinophils है, इयोसिनोफिल्स जो है, हमने बात की थी कि इसके अंदर जब हम इसको स्टेन करते हैं तो वहां पे रेड ग्रैन्यूल्स प्रेजेंट होते हैं, और वो रेड ग्रैन्यूल्स इसलिए होते हैं बिकॉज दे अटेन द एसिडिक डाई, राइट. अब ये इयोसिनोफिल्स जो है, दे आर वेरी, वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट. दीज इयोसिनोफिल्स जो है, दे आर वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट इन एक्चुअली अगेंस्ट द पैरासाइटिक इन्फेक्शंस. पैरासाइटिक इन्फेक्शंस. And parasitic infections like worms or helminths, that is actually worms. So helminths जो है, these are actually जो है these parasites, और ये parasitic infections के against जो है, that means against the parasites in eosinophils का एक बहुत important role रहता है. Okay, these eosinophils have a small, very small phagocytic property as well. That is very little phagocytic property, और phagocytosis जो है, that is usually done by the neutrophils and the macrophages or monocytes, right. लेकिन थोड़ी सी जो है phagocytic property जो है eosinophils के पास भी रहती है. और eosinophils जो है, apart from this parasitic infection, they are actually very important during the allergic diseases. And these allergic diseases, for example, asthma. तो asthma में अगर हम देखेंगे, और any other allergic disease, इनमें जो है हमारे इन eosinophils का count जो है बढ़ जाता है, because they have a major role during these parasitic infections or these allergic diseases. Now let us talk about the secretions of these eosinophils. These secretions are very important to make them these eosinophils, or to help these eosinophils fight against these parasites or allergic diseases. The first thing which is actually secreted is eosinophil peroxidase, and then eosinophil cationic protein, and then the major basic protein. अब ऑल दीज जो है एंजाइम्स और प्रोटीन्स ये इयोसिनोफिल को हेल्प करते हैं इन फाइटिंग अगेंस्ट द पैरासाइट्स, मोस्ट इंपॉर्टेंटली द वर्म्स और हेलमिंट्स, एंड टू फाइट अगेंस्ट द जो है, एंड दीज इयोसिनोफिल्स आल्सो हैव अ मेजर रोल or a small role, I'm sorry, in during these allergic diseases, for example the asthma, right? That is about the eosinophils. इसके बाद we have the basophils, and basophils जो है they are actually very important for during these basophils have a very important role in the acute hypersensitivity reactions, acute hypersensitivity reactions. And these basophils are actually very important for the process of healing. So healing process में बेसोफिल्स का एक इंपॉर्टेंट रोल रहता है, क्योंकि healing process जो है, जब healing होता है after that injury has to be followed by the healing process. तो healing process के दौरान बेसोफिल्स का जो काउंट रहता है वो थोड़ा सा बढ़ जाता है, because they have a very important role in healing process. They actually increase that blood circulation towards that damaged site. राइट अब ये बेसोफिल्स जो है इनके ग्रैन्यूल्स में एक्चुअली जो है, जो इनके ग्रैन्यूल्स सिक्रीट करते हैं, दैट इज एक्चुअली हिपैरिन. The first thing is heparin, and heparin we all know is the natural anticoagulant. अगर जो है ये बेसोफिल्स हेपारिन जो है सिक्रीट करते हैं, तो वो हेपारिन एक्चुअली इस ब्लड वेसल के अंदर क्लॉटिंग फॉर्मेशन को प्रिवेंट करता है, because we do not want to form a clot inside the normal blood vessel. तो उस इंट्रावेस्कुलर क्लॉटिंग के लिए जो है उसको प्रिवेंट करने के लिए एक्चुअली हेपारिन इज द नेचुरल एंटीकोएगुलेंट, और वो हेपारिन जो है दैट इज सिक्रेटेड बाय द बेसोफिल्स. इसके बाद we have the histamine, we have the bradykinin, we have the serotonin, and all these things are actually very important for these acute hypersensitivity reactions, right? And then we have the proteases and myeloperoxidases, and proteases and myeloperoxidases जो है they are very important. जो यहाँ पे भी हमने देखा था neutrophils में, they are very important in the destruction of microorganisms, right? So इसके बाद जो है we are done with the granulocytes, जो है neutrophils, eosinophils and basophils. Now let us talk about the monocytes. I've already told you that monocytes जो है they are very important in providing us the first line of defense along with the neutrophils. So monocytes, they also provide us the first line of defense. And these monocytes are actually very important phagocytic cells. Phagocytic cells, because I have already told you that neutrophils are and the monocytes when they come out of the blood circulation, they come into the tissue site, then they become macrophages. And both these neutrophils and macrophages are actually the phagocytic cells. They are involved in the phagocytosis process, that is taking the जो है microorganism, most importantly the bacteria, into the cell and then destroying them there. राइट. सो मोनोसाइट्स जो है ये न्यूट्रोफिल्स के बाद, ये भी मैंने आपको कहा न्यूट्रोफिल्स के बाद जो है ये मोनोसाइट्स ही इस टिश्यू साइट में जो है बाहर आ जाते हैं, right? And apart from this phagocytic property of the monocytes, these monocytes are very important antigen presenting cells. Antigen presenting cells. Actually जो फॉर एग्जाम्पल बैक्टीरिया के पास जो ये एंटीजन है, मैंने आपको पहले ही कहा था, ये एंटीजन जो है हमें लिम्फोसाइट्स तक पहुंचाना है, ये हमें जो है इम्यून हेडक्वार्टर्स में पहुंचाना है हमारी बॉडी में. द लिम्फोसाइट्स विच आर प्रेजेंट इन द लिम्फेटिक ऑर्गन्स और विच आर प्रेजेंट इन द लिम्फ नोड्स. अब वो लिम्फोसाइट्स को जो है उनके पास हमें ये एंटीजन पहुंचाना है. अब न्यूट्रोफिल्स जब जो है इस एंटीजन को रिसीव करते हैं फ्रॉम दैट बैक्टीरिया, तो इस एंटीजन को जो है ऐसे ही इंटरस्टिशियल फ्लूइड में भेज देते हैं और इंटरस्टिशियल फ्लूइड से ये हमारे लिम्फ नोड्स तक पहुंच जाता है. लेकिन मोनोसाइट्स इसके बारे में जो है हम डिटेल में बात करेंगे इन दी व्हेन वी विल टॉक अबाउट द इम्यूनिटी। लेकिन जो मोनोसाइट्स होते हैं, जब ये इस एंटीजन को रिसीव करते हैं फ्रॉम दी, या जब ये बैक्टीरिया को डिग्रेड करते हैं, तो वहां पे जो एंटीजन प्रेजेंट होता है, तो इस एंटीजन को ये लिम्फोसाइट्स तक खुद ही लेके जाते हैं। दैट इज व्हाई वी कॉल दीज मोनोसाइट्स एज एंटीजन प्रेजेंटिंग सेल्स, राइट। अब ये एंटीजन प्रेजेंटिंग सेल्स जो है, या ये जो मोनोसाइट्स है, जब ये टिश्यूज में पहुंच जाते हैं, दे आर यूजुअली कॉल्ड एज मैक्रोफेजेस। लेकिन ये मैक्रोफेजेस और मोनोसाइट्स जो है, इनको हम अलग अलग टिश्यू में अलग अलग नाम भी देते हैं। For example, these monocytes, when they are present in the central nervous system, let me write it here. These monocytes, when they are present in the central nervous system, they are called as microglia. Right, they are called as microglia. Microglia is actually a neuroglial cell, but it is actually a monocyte which is present, or macrophage which is present there in the central nervous system. And then in the liver, we have a special phagocytic cell or macrophage. We call that as Kupffer cell. So Kupffer cells are present there, which are actually these macrophages. And then in the bones, we have the osteoclasts. And osteoclasts जो है, which are involved in breaking down that bone tissue. And osteoclasts जो है, they are formed by the combination of many macrophages actually. Then जो है, ये osteoclasts जो है, ये form होते हैं। अब ये osteoclasts जो है, ये भी actually जो है हमारे bones में macrophages ही होते हैं। अब ये मोनोसाइट्स जो है, ये कौन कौन सी चीजें सिक्रीट करते हैं? दे सिक्रीट इंटरल्यूकिन 1, दैट इज वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट। एज सून एज, मैंने अभी आपको कहा कि दे आर द एंटीजन प्रेजेंटिंग सेल्स, एज सून एज दे प्रेजेंट द एंटीजन टू द टी लिम्फोसाइट्स, तो टी लिम्फोसाइट्स को एक्टिवेट करने के लिए ये जो है इंटरल्यूकिन 1 जो है वहां पे सिक्रीट करते हैं। So interleukin 1 is very important for the activation of lymphocytes. And then colony stimulating factor. Colony stimulating factor is very important in the process of leukopoiesis or hematopoiesis, most importantly the leukopoiesis. Because हमें जो है अभी we are infected by any bacteria or any pathogen, तो we will need more and more white blood cells. तो हमें white blood cells के production को increase करना है, हमें white blood cells के formation को increase करना है। तो उसके लिए monocytes का एक रोल यह भी रहता है कि वो colony stimulating factor जो है रिलीज करता है। colony stimulating factor bone marrow में जाके उस formation of white blood cell process को जो है stimulate करता है। ओके, एंड देन कीमोकाइंस जो है, यही है जब ये मोनोसाइट्स यहाँ पे पहुंच जाते हैं, बैक्टीरिया को एनगल्फ किया और ये मोनोसाइट जो है यहाँ पे एक्टिवेट हो गए, तो ये कीमोकाइंस आर दीज केमिकल्स व्हिच आर सिक्रीटेड बाय द मोनोसाइट्स व्हिच विल एक्चुअली स्टिमुलेट द प्रोसेस ऑफ कीमोटैक्सिस। इट विल एक्चुअली अट्रैक्ट मोर एंड मोर व्हाइट ब्लड सेल्स, मोस्ट इंपॉर्टेंटली द न्यूट्रोफिल्स एंड द मोनोसाइट्स टुवर्ड्स द डैमेज्ड टिश्यू, राइट। इसके बाद we have the lymphocytes, that is the last type, and lymphocytes are very important cells which actually provides us the immunity. Okay, और हमने already discuss करा है that lymphocytes जो है, based on the functions of lymphocytes, we have two types of lymphocytes. One is the T lymphocyte, and another is the B lymphocyte. एंड टी लिम्फोसाइट एंड बी लिम्फोसाइट के अलावा लिम्फोसाइट्स का एक टाइप है नेचुरल किलर सेल्स, वी विल टॉक अबाउट दैट इन द इम्यूनिटी। और जो ये लिम्फोसाइट्स है, मैंने आपको भी कहा दैट दे प्रोवाइड अस इम्यूनिटी, और इम्यूनिटी हमें जो है पता है इज ऑफ टू टाइप्स, वन इज द ह्यूमोरल इम्यूनिटी एंड देन देयर इज सेल मीडिएटेड इम्यूनिटी। अब जो ये टी लिम्फोसाइट्स है, दे आर रिस्पॉन्सिबल फॉर प्रोवाइडिंग अस द सेल मीडिएटेड इम्यूनिटी, and the B lymphocytes are responsible for providing us humoral immunity. Humoral immunity means these B lymphocytes actually form or they produce or they secrete the antibodies which then go and fight against or they destroy the antigens, right? The antigens which are with these microorganisms which has invaded our tissue, राइट। अब जो ये लिम्फोसाइट्स है, ये जो है ये सारी चीजें सिक्रीट करते हैं। द फर्स्ट थिंग इज इंटरल्यूकिन 2, 4 एंड 5। दिस इंटरल्यूकिन 2, 4 एंड 5 जो है, हमें इनका रोल एक्चुअली इम्यूनिटी में डिस्कस करना है। जब टी लिम्फोसाइट्स जो है जब वो एक्टिवेट होते हैं, तो फिर ये जो है ये 2, 4 एंड 5 इंटरल्यूकिन जो है सिक्रीट करते हैं, विच इज वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट फॉर जो है एक्टिवेटिंग दी बी लिम्फोसाइट्स, फॉर proliferation of B lymphocytes, for the differentiation of B lymphocytes, all that we are going to talk about in immunity. So वहां पे जो है इंटरल्यूकिन 2, 4 एंड 5 का जो है रोल रहता है। इसके बाद जो है गामा इंटरफेरॉन्स जो है इनका रोल रहता है, और जो ये गामा इंटरफेरॉन्स है ये डिफरेंट टाइप्स ऑफ लिम्फोसाइट्स को जो है डिफरेंट टाइप्स ऑफ जो है लिम्फोसाइट्स को एक्चुअली ये स्टिमुलेट करता है। फॉर एग्जांपल, इट स्टिमुलेट्स द साइटोटॉक्सिक सेल, इट स्टिमुलेट्स द नेचुरल किलर सेल, एंड इट आल्सो स्टिमुलेट्स द मैक्रोफेजेस। तो ये इन गामा इंटरफेरॉन्स का जो है रोल रहता है। Okay, and इसके बाद lysosomal enzymes which will be very important for the destruction of these microorganisms. And then we have the tumor necrosing factor, and tumor necrosing factor is very important for the necrosis of tumor. It is very important for the activation of immune system, and it is also important for promoting the inflammation. Right? So you don't worry, we have a separate lecture about the lymphocytes. We will talk about the mechanism of T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes in detail, and how they are activated actually, and what they secrete and what is their action. वो हम सारा जो है immunity में discuss करेंगे, जहाँ पे इसके बारे में जो है अलग से lecture होने वाला है। We will talk about right from here जो है फैगोसाइटोसिस वगैरह, वो सारी चीजें जो है हम मेनली देन वी विल टॉक अबाउट फोकस ऑन दी फंक्शंस ऑफ लिम्फोसाइट्स, वो वहां पे हम बात करेंगे। और लिम्फोसाइट्स भी कीमोकाइंस जो है वो सिक्रीट करते हैं कीमोकाइंस विच आर वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट फॉर द प्रोसेस ऑफ कीमोटैक्सिस, दैट इज अट्रैक्टिंग द व्हाइट ब्लड सेल्स टुवर्ड्स द डैमेज्ड टिश्यू। That is the chemokines, which are also secreted by the lymphocytes, and they are also secreted by the monocytes and other types of white blood cells. Okay, so that is all about the functions and the secretions of the different types of white blood cells. I hope it was clear. See you in the next lecture. Allah.